I'll never forget the sound the door made. A squeak, a slam, then a rattle of silver trays against the wall. That's where they placed me, my son's wedding day. My only son, David, and instead of sitting at the head table like the proud mother of the groom, I was wedged behind the swinging kitchen door. No name card, no ribbon-tied chair, just a folding seat with a paper napkin tossed over it like some joke. I sat down because I didn't want to cause a scene. Not yet. The chair wobbled on the greasy tiles. To my left, a cart stacked with dirty plates leaned like it might topple at any moment. To my right, a tray of half-eaten shrimp cocktail, pink tails curling in little puddles of melted ice. The smell of marinara sauce drifted in thick waves from the kitchen, mixing with the acrid tang of burnt garlic. I could feel the heat of the ovens rising against my neck, the sweat clinging to the silk of my dress. I told myself to breathe. Just breathe. But the truth was pressing hard against my ribs. I had paid for this wedding. Every flower, every rented chair out there in the ballroom, every tiny glass of champagne that was now being clinked by laughing strangers. Tens of thousands of dollars I had spent. Because David said, "Mom, Sophia's parents don't really have it. But this is our dream wedding. Could you?" And of course I said yes. What else was I supposed to say? I remembered the nights when David was still a boy, coughing through his asthma fits. I'd sit by his bedside, rubbing his back in circles, whispering that he was safe, that I'd never leave him. I remembered skipping meals so he could have soccer cleats that wouldn't fall apart mid-season. The years I worked double shifts at the diner, letting my body ache so his wouldn't. Every sacrifice piled up into this one day, this celebration that was supposed to be ours. And yet here I was, invisible. I leaned forward, peeking through the crack of the swinging door. I could see the ballroom lit in gold. Chandeliers sparkled. Guests lifted their glasses high. At the center, Sophia twirled in her white gown, laughing into David's ear like the world had never known sorrow. My son's face, my boy who once begged me to tape his science fair project together, was beaming. But not once did he turn toward me. I searched for my name in the printed programs I glimpsed in guests' hands. The bold letters scrolled across the thick paper. Lists of speakers, dances, blessings. But my name wasn't there. No mother of the groom toast. No slow dance reserved for the woman who had carried him through every storm. I pressed my napkin to my mouth, pretending to dab away sauce, hiding the tremble in my lip. My eyes burned, but I refused to let tears fall. Not here. Not with the smell of frying oil and scorched tomato thick in my throat. This wasn't an oversight. No one forgets the mother of the groom. This was a decision, a choice made by someone, and silently approved by my son. The first cut always feels like disbelief. You tell yourself there's been a mistake. Some confusion with the seating chart. Maybe someone swapped the name cards. But the second cut goes deeper. That's when you realize you were meant to bleed. I clutched the edge of the tray table, nails digging into the cold metal, and I felt my pulse hammer in my ears. A part of me wanted to storm through those doors, slam my fist against the microphone, demand the place I had earned. But another part, quieter, steadier, told me to wait, to watch, to let every humiliation etch itself into my memory until it became fuel. That's when the idea first sparked. A flicker at the edge of my mind, almost comforting in its sharpness. They thought they had hidden me away, erased me from the story. But I still held the pen. I still held every receipt, every checkbook stub, every power that money can give a person. So I sat in that kitchen chair, surrounded by dirty dishes and the hiss of boiling water. And I smiled. I let the humiliation soak into my bones like marinade into meat. Because I knew one thing with certainty, this wasn't the end of the story. It was only the opening scene. From the crack of the swinging door, I watched my son's life unfold without me. The music swelled, the laughter of guests carried on the air, and the chandeliers sprayed golden light across the ballroom. I was tucked into the shadows, a woman erased from her own story. Through the narrow slit, I caught sight of Sophia's parents. They were radiant, faces glowing with pride, as if they were royalty presiding over a coronation. Her mother clutched a tissue delicately, dabbing at tears of joy. Her father stood tall, chest puffed, shaking hands with distant cousins and co-workers like he'd built this empire himself. And then there was David, my David, smiling so wide it seemed to split his face. He laughed with them as though I didn't exist. As though the decades I spent scraping and clawing for his better life were nothing but dust swept under a rug. A waiter brushed past me, pushing a cart of clattering glassware. I turned my face away. But not before I caught the reflection of myself in the metal, the makeup carefully applied. The silk of my dress clinging with sweat. The pearls I had saved for years to buy, now cheapened by proximity to grease and trash. I looked like a ghost haunting the edges of someone else's celebration. The program slipped from a guest's hand near the door, and I bent forward just far enough to see it on the carpet. The words leapt out like knives: father-daughter dance, best man speech, blessing by Sophia's aunt, but nowhere, was my name. No mother-son dance. No recognition, no acknowledgement that I even existed. I bit down on the inside of my cheek, tasting copper. I would not cry, not here, not where the smell of scorched garlic hung in the air like mockery. I folded the napkin into neat squares on my lap, busying my hands so no one could see them shake. A burst of applause roared from the ballroom. I peeked again and saw Sophia and David cutting the cake, his hand covering hers in a perfect pose for the photographer. The knife sliced clean through tiers of buttercream and fondant, each layer another reminder of checks I had written. Sophia's eyes flicked toward me for just a fraction of a second. I don't know if she actually saw me there, half hidden behind the door, but her smirk told me everything. This wasn't oversight. This was design. I understood then. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't the chaos of a busy wedding day, some forgotten formality. No, this was deliberate. My son and his bride had chosen to cut me out. They had planned my absence, scripted my invisibility, and left me with nothing but crumbs. The rage that rose inside me was not loud. It wasn't the kind that explodes in screams or shatters glasses against walls. No, this rage was quiet, coiled tight, like a snake waiting in tall grass. I felt it in my chest, in the steady pounding of my heart, in the way my breath smoothed out into something almost calm. I dabbed my lips with the napkin again, pretending for anyone who might glance my way that I was merely tidying myself. But beneath the act, my jaw ached from the pressure of my teeth grinding. My knuckles whitened around the stem of a water glass I had been given, condensation sliding over my fingers like ice. David's laughter echoed through the doorway, warm and booming, and for the first time in my life it sounded foreign. I had raised this boy. I had carried him, fed him, defended him when the world tried to chew him up. And now, on the one day meant to honor our bond, he treated me like an afterthought, like a stranger who had wandered in uninvited. I told myself to stay seated, to remain still. If I moved, if I let myself erupt, I might burn everything too soon, and they didn't deserve the satisfaction of seeing me break. So I sat there, smiling faintly, as though I were simply resting, as though I weren't bleeding inside. Guests laughed, glasses clinked, the band struck up a waltz, and I waited, holding my rage like a hidden blade, because I knew something they had forgotten. This entire wedding, every flower, every rented chair, every note of music, existed because I made it possible. And though they thought they'd written me out of the story, they had underestimated me. The quiet rage inside me hardened into resolve. Not yet, I told myself, but soon. When dessert was served, I finally stood up. No one noticed. Not a single guest looked toward the kitchen as I slipped through the swinging door and into the dim hallway. My heels clicked softly on the tiles. Each step measured, deliberate. I walked past the bathrooms, past the stack of extra chairs leaning against the wall, until I found a small alcove with a payphone still bolted to the wall. Though I didn't need it, my cell phone rested heavy in my clutch. Charged, waiting. I leaned against the cool plaster and pulled it out. My fingers shook for only a moment before they steadied. I had been planning payments for this wedding for a year. Months of lists, of notes scrawled on envelopes, of invoices folded neatly into a red folder I kept in the top drawer of my desk. Every florist upgrade, every band rehearsal fee, every last-minute request Sophia had made to ensure her day was perfect. I had written the checks. I had wired the transfers. I knew the numbers by heart. The first call went to the florist. I had memorized the manager's extension. When he answered, cheerful and distracted, I cleared my throat. "This is Teresa Malone," I said, voice steady. "Cancel the standing order. Effective immediately." There was silence. Then a flustered stammer about trucks already en route. "Turn them around," I said. "You'll be paid for what you've delivered. But nothing more leaves that shop. Understood?" My voice left no room for argument. By the time he hung up, my hands no longer trembled. The second call went to the band. They were still waiting on their full balance, half of which was due tonight. Before the second set, the manager's voice was cocky, assured, until I introduced myself. "I'm the one signing your checks," I said. "Pack up after the first dance. There will be no encore." He sputtered. I didn't care. He'd be lucky to get the partial payment I'd already wired. The third call was the most satisfying, the bar service. They had been Sophia's idea. An open top-shelf bar all night long fantasy that had doubled my original budget. I'd agreed because my son wanted it for her. Now, listening to the bar manager's confused protests, I almost smiled. "Shut it down," I said. "The groom's family is no longer covering your tab. Any further pours will be on the couple." I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my clutch. The ballroom still pulsed with music and laughter. But now I carried a secret no one else did. In less than an hour, the roses would vanish from the tables. The band would pack up their instruments. And the guests would find themselves staring at empty bars with tabs they hadn't expected to pay. I thought about the Venmo message I had discovered 2 weeks earlier. One Sophia had sent to David. I had seen it when David borrowed my laptop and forgot to log out. The message was short, smug, almost cruel. "Don't worry, babe. Your mom's paying. Go big, go bigger. She won't say no." I had sat with those words. The sting of them, the mockery. They had treated me like an endless wallet, a resource to be mined until it ran dry. They had mistaken my sacrifices for weakness, my silence for permission. Not anymore. As I straightened my dress and smoothed my hair, I realized the humiliation I had felt in that kitchen had already begun to shift into something else. Strength. I wasn't crying anymore. My hands no longer trembled. I was calm, almost unnervingly calm, the kind of calm you feel when you finally accept the truth and stop begging it to change. Out there, through those doors, David and Sophia thought they had erased me, but they had no idea I was already rewriting the ending. Sleep would not come that night. I lay in my bed, the silence of the house pressing down heavier than the heat of the ballroom ovens. My dress still hung over the chair by the window, the pearls coiled in a shallow dish. I could smell the faint trace of marinara in my hair, as if the humiliation from that kitchen had followed me home. At 2 in the morning, I gave up. I rose, padded barefoot down the hall, and pulled open the bottom drawer of my desk. Inside was the red folder I had carried for months, the one filled with invoices, receipts, and carefully itemized budgets. I set it on the dining room table and flipped it open, the papers whispering like dry leaves. For a while, I stared at the neat rows of expenses, each line a reminder of how easily I had said yes whenever David or Sophia asked for more. But beneath the stack, where I kept documents that mattered more than money, lay a sealed envelope. My hand trembled as I lifted it. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable. Michael's. My late husband. He had written it before he died. Tucked it away with a note that said, "For Teresa, when she's ready." I had never been ready. Not until tonight. I slid a knife under the flap and unfolded the pages inside. His words blurred at first, the ink swimming as my eyes filled. But then they sharpened into lines that cut clean through me. "David is not your biological son." The sentence sat there, heavy, immovable. My breath caught, and I pressed a hand to my chest. He explained, clumsily, apologetically, that in the early days of our marriage, before I had even known him well, there had been an affair, a mistake. The baby that resulted was not mine to bear, but mine to raise. He had begged me, silently, without saying the words aloud all those years, to accept the child as my own. And I had. I had taken that boy into my arms the day he was born and never once let him go. Until now. I dropped the letter to the table, staring at the grain of the wood as if it could steady me. Pain burned sharp, but beneath it was something else, clarity. David had not been my blood, but he had been my life. Every sacrifice, every dollar, every sleepless night at his bedside, I had given those freely. And yet, when the time came for him to honor me, he had turned his back. A sob tried to rise. But I pressed it down. I would not collapse. Not after what they had done to me. I reached back into the folder and my fingers brushed against a second envelope. Smaller, older, edges yellowing with time. My name was not on it. Only a single word. Truth. I opened it with hands that no longer shook. Inside was a note not from Michael but from the lawyer who had handled his estate. The words were blunt, merciless. David was not meant for you at all. He was a child abandoned by another family. Passed into your care under circumstances Michael never explained fully. He left this note to give you the choice he denied you years ago, to know. Or to remain in ignorance. I read it 3 times. My vision sharpening with each pass. David was never mine, not by blood, not by destiny. He had been placed in my arms like an afterthought. And I had carried him as if he were the center of my universe. And tonight, he had exiled me to a kitchen chair. The betrayal, once sharp, began to transform. It loosened its grip and, in its place, something lighter emerged. Relief. I was free. Free from the illusion that motherhood had to mean endless sacrifice without return. Free from the weight of believing I had failed at something that was never truly mine to hold. I gathered both letters, placed them back in the folder, and closed it gently. The room felt different now, emptier. Yes, but also clearer. I poured myself a glass of water, sat at the table, and listened to the quiet hum of the refrigerator. The humiliation of the wedding had cracked me open. But these letters, this truth, had changed me. I was no longer just the woman abandoned in the kitchen. No longer the mother erased from her son's story. I was something else now. Someone who finally understood that her worth was not tied to a seat at any table but the one she chose for herself. For the first time in years, I smiled, not bitterly, not with rage, but with the faint glow of a woman who has finally stopped begging to belong. The morning after I read those letters, I walked through my house like a stranger. The framed photographs on the walls seemed to glare at me. David's high school graduation. His first Little League team. The blurry snapshot of him blowing out 18 candles. Each one was proof of how much I had poured into him. How much I had bent myself into the shape of mother, provider, shield. But as I looked at those images, something inside me shifted. One by one, I began to take them down. Not in anger, but in release. I wrapped each frame in newspaper, set them in a box, and slid it into the back of the closet. My house didn't need to be a museum to someone who had chosen to forget me. My walls, my shelves, my life, they could be mine again. The quiet felt different now. Not oppressive, but spacious. For the first time in decades, I realized I didn't have to be defined by what I had given away. I could be defined by what I chose to keep. That night, I stood in my kitchen, my own kitchen. Not the one behind swinging doors and greasy trays, and cooked just for myself. Not a reheated casserole stretched to feed a teenager. Not a rushed sandwich eaten after a double shift. But a meal for me. I boiled pasta until it was al dente. Tossed it with butter, lemon juice, and fresh parsley. I set the table with one plate, one fork, one glass of white wine. Then I lit a candle and turned on the jazz station from the old radio in the corner. As I twirled the pasta onto my fork, I felt something almost electric. This was the first time I had ever cooked to please myself. Not someone else. The first time the meal, the music, the moment belonged entirely to me. Between bites, I took out a notebook and started writing names. Not family, not people bound to me by blood or obligation, but the ones who had shown up for me without asking anything in return. Claire, my neighbor who always brought me soup when I was sick. Mr. Henderson, the retired teacher down the street who shoveled my driveway without being asked. Dina, the bookseller who saved me the newest novels she knew I'd love. Janet, the nurse who held my hand the night Michael died. I wasn't making a guest list for obligation. I was curating a new kind of family, the kind you choose. The kind who sees you, not for what you provide but for who you are. For years, I had polished my house for holidays. Cooking elaborate meals for relatives who barely looked up from their phones. I had stretched budgets and time to keep the illusion of togetherness alive. But as I wrote those names, I realized I didn't want to host for people who didn't care if I was in the room. I wanted to fill my home with those who made me feel alive. I closed the notebook, rinsed my plate, and left the candle burning on the table long after the pasta was gone. The house glowed in the soft light. Not empty, not lonely, just waiting. The next days were a quiet flurry of preparation. I went to the market for fresh bread and wine. I pulled the good plates from the cabinet, the ones I used to save for special occasions. I polished the silver. I bought flowers, not roses or lilies in stiff arrangements like the wedding, but sunflowers and wild daisies, loose and alive. Each step felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. The Teresa who laughed easily. The Teresa who loved books and jazz and lemon pasta. The Teresa who had been buried under years of sacrifice, she was resurfacing. On the night of the gathering, I lit candles in every room. I set out bowls of olives and cheese. Uncorked bottles of wine. Let the record player spin soft blues. When the doorbell rang, Claire stood there with a pie. Henderson with a story already spilling from his lips. Dina with a tote bag of novels. Janet with a bottle of champagne. They stepped inside, and the house filled with laughter before the night had even begun. As I poured wine into glasses, Claire raised hers and said, "Here's to Teresa, for reminding us it's never too late to sit at your own table." I felt my throat tighten, but I smiled. I lifted my glass and answered, "To every mother who gave until she was told it wasn't enough. May we never sit in the kitchen again." We clinked glasses, and the sound was sweeter than any toast I'd missed at that wedding. For the first time in my life, I wasn't someone's mother, someone's wife, someone's provider. I was simply myself, and it was enough. The night of my gathering was warm. The kind of September evening where the air still holds the sweetness of summer but hints at autumn on its breath. I had left the windows cracked, and the faint chorus of crickets drifted in as I lit the last candle on the dining table. The sunflowers I'd bought leaned cheerfully in a glass vase, their golden heads nodding in the candlelight. By 7 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Claire stood there first, holding a pie wrapped in foil and smiling like she had been waiting for this invitation her whole life. Behind her came Henderson, wearing his usual plaid shirt and carrying a six-pack of beer. He winked as he walked in, already launching into a story about the neighbor's dog tearing up his garden. Dina arrived with 2 bags of books she thought I'd love. "You need new stories, Teresa," she said, pressing them into my hands. And Janet, dear Janet, came last, her arms full of champagne and a bouquet of lavender. I ushered them inside, and soon the house was alive. Wine poured into glasses, bread was sliced and passed around. Laughter ricocheted off the walls. The room glowed with warmth, not from chandeliers or rented uplighting, but from something real. These people weren't here for obligation, or for what I could give them. They were here for me. The table filled with food, the pasta I had made, bowls of olives, wedges of cheese, platters of roasted vegetables. Henderson slapped the table as he told a story about teaching 5th graders who thought Abraham Lincoln was still alive. Claire wiped tears of laughter from her cheeks. Janet leaned over, hand on my arm, saying, "You look different tonight, Teresa, lighter." She was right. I felt lighter. For years, I had been weighed down by the role of provider, the endless cycle of giving without return. But now, as I listened to these voices mingling in my home, I realized I wasn't giving tonight, I was receiving. Their laughter, their stories, their presence, it was a gift. One I had denied myself for too long. At one point, Claire raised her glass. "To Teresa," she said, voice firm, "for teaching us that it's never too late to sit at the head of your own table." The others lifted their glasses, their faces warm in the candlelight. My throat tightened, but I managed to raise mine too. "To every mother," I said, "who gave until she was told it still wasn't enough. May we never again be sent to sit in the kitchen." We drank, and the sound of clinking glasses was sweeter than any toast at David's wedding. The night stretched on. We told stories of youth, of heartbreak, of strange coincidences that had shaped our lives. Henderson leaned back in his chair, laughing so hard he wheezed. Claire played the piano in the living room, her fingers stumbling but spirited. Janet taught us a toast in Gaelic she remembered from her grandmother. and Dina read aloud a passage from a book she swore I'd love. Her voice carrying like music across the room. For the first time in decades, I felt seen, not as a role, not as a wallet, not as an afterthought, but as Teresa. Just Teresa. As the night wound down, and my guests gathered their coats, Claire hugged me tight. You built something tonight, she whispered, not just a dinner, a family. After they left, I stood in the doorway, the night air cool against my skin, and looked back at my dining room. The candles had burned low, wax pooling on the table. Empty glasses, crumbs of bread, and scattered flower petals lay across the wood. But instead of feeling like a mess, it felt alive. It felt earned. For the first time in my life, I wasn't desperate for someone else's approval, for a seat at someone else's table. I had created my own, and the right people had come. I blew out the last candle and whispered into the quiet. This is mine. Finally, this is mine. 3 days after the dinner, the house still smelled faintly of roasted vegetables and candle wax. The flowers on the table had wilted, their heads bowing low, but I left them there as a reminder. Joy had lived here. I was rinsing wine glasses at the sink when I heard a knock at the front door. I dried my hands, half expecting Claire or Janet to have forgotten something. But when I opened the door, it was David. He stood on the porch looking tired, almost lost. His tie was crooked, his eyes bloodshot, and for a moment I saw the boy he had once been, the boy who used to run to me after school. Cheeks flushed, hair messy, asking what was for dinner. But the man before me was a stranger, weighed down by choices he could never undo. Mom, he said, his voice cracking on the word. Can I come in? I stepped aside silently. He walked past me into the living room, his shoulders hunched as if the air itself pressed down on him. He didn't sit, just stood there, shifting from foot to foot, glancing at the boxes of photographs stacked by the wall. Why didn't you tell me? He asked finally. I folded my arms. Tell you what? He hesitated, then swallowed hard. That you cancelled everything. The band, the bar, the flowers. People were talking. Sophia was furious. I had to cover half the costs myself. I looked at him, calm, steady. That wedding was paid for with my hands. My years, my sacrifices. You and your wife thought I would keep giving without end. You were wrong. His jaw tightened, but I didn't stop. I walked over to the box by the sofa and pulled out the red folder. Inside were the receipts, every invoice, every Venmo transfer, every check stub. I set the folder on the coffee table between us. Look, I said, this is the record of what I gave you. Every cent, every hour I worked, every promise I kept. And when the time came for you to stand up for me, to honor me, you let them shove me into a kitchen chair. He looked down, guilt flickering across his face. It wasn't like that, he muttered. Don't lie to me, David. My voice sharpened, not loud, but cutting. It was exactly like that. You let them erase me. And you went along with it. He opened his mouth to protest. But I reached into the folder again and pulled out the letters. The first from Michael, the second from the lawyer. I held them out, my hand steady. These are yours to read now. They're the truth I carried alone for years. He took them with shaking fingers, scanning the pages quickly at first, then slower, his face draining of color. When he finished, he looked at me as though seeing me for the first time. So I'm not even your son? He whispered. I inhaled sharply, fighting the ache in my chest. By blood, no, but by love? By sacrifice? By choice? You were mine. I made you mine every single day of your life. And when it mattered, you chose someone else over me. Tears welled in his eyes, and for a fleeting second I thought he might collapse into my arms. Beg forgiveness. Promise change. Instead, he lowered his gaze, shame written across every line of his face. I'm sorry, he said, but the words were weak, flimsy, barely carried by breath. I shook my head. Sorry doesn't rewrite what you allowed to happen. Sorry doesn't put me back in that ballroom, or erase the image of me sitting among dirty dishes while your bride's family celebrated. The silence stretched between us, thick and final. He shifted, as though waiting for me to soften, to invite him back into my life with the same endless forgiveness I had always given. But I didn't. David, I said, my voice even. I raised you. I gave you everything I had. And now, I'm choosing myself. I won't sit in the kitchen anymore. Not for you. Not for anyone. He looked at me one last time. Then gathered the folder and the letters, holding them like stones too heavy to bear. Without another word, he turned and walked out the door. I listened to the sound of his car starting, the engine fading down the street, until the night swallowed it whole. The house was quiet again, but not empty. The echo of laughter from my dinner still lingered in the walls. The flowers drooped. The candles had burned down, but the warmth remained. I went to bed that night without tears. In the morning, I woke with sunlight streaming through the window, and for the first time in decades, I felt light, free, not a shadow, not an afterthought, but the author of my own life. I had been erased, and then I had reclaimed myself. And as I stood at the kitchen counter, making coffee just for me, I whispered a promise into the steam: I will never be hidden again.